Last year, I made a video talking about sex, violence, and the effects on writing and character development in video games. Unsurprisingly, it was age restricted the moment it was uploaded for saying no words and not dancing around the issues with ad-friendly baby speak, but during one of the sections, I talked about how badly games tend to handle romance and relationships. You can go watch the original video if you're interested, mostly so I don't have to double up here, but I was thinking about it again recently with Dragon Age Origins, and I'm also in the middle of replaying Baldur's Gate 2 again as well. Now seems like a good time to revisit and expand on the topic, so to start with, I'm going to show you a scene. That particular one comes with a lot of baggage, I get that, but ask yourself this: what does it reveal about character? What emotions does it inspire? Is it just there for a laugh? Is it the summation of an entire character arc? Well, no, it's just more of the safe kink crap that has become so pervasive in RPGs and many other games today. I won't go into the whole history here, but BioWare essentially pioneered romance in RPGs. This was a natural evolution of their character-driven stories, and the idea of bringing arcs closer to what you could theoretically explore in tabletop. Companions alone were novel as it is. That was still a fairly new idea at the time, whereas, at least outside of JRPGs, most games had just been the lone wandering hero like Ultima, or dungeon crawling in Tez Arena and the like. Now, you can argue this was more a result of technical limitations of the time, but romance in something like Baldur's Gate 2 or Neverwinter Nights was conveyed solely through text. There weren't the fancy mocapped cutscenes we know today, but whether you personally like that trade-off or not, it kept the focus on the character and how the two of you grew closer over the entire game. Sex was still the reward, in a sense, and I still think that's a problem which we'll get more into in a bit, but whether consciously or not, it meant the writers didn't spend time salivating over how the actual scene plays out, and more of what happens between the two characters before and afterwards. Because that's the central issue: sex as reward. That's not how it works in real life. I mean, if it is, you should probably go see couples counseling, or get the hell out of there while you still can. Because a relationship doesn't start, or it's not predicated, on how often the two of you bang. That you don't really know a character until you get to blow their back out, and then they just become an object, essentially. That it's done, and now the game or story might as well end. Dragon Age 2, as much as its character writing may shine at times, despite everything the game had going against it, is another easy example of this. Let's just ignore the fact how unrealistic it is that everyone is bisexual or player sexual, because the sex there is not only goofy to look at with a cartoony art style, but blown off, and that's it. Characters don't really change. Now, you could say that sex and romance are two different things, but are they? Because that's the expectation now. In most RPGs, most games that even attempt something like this. When do players get to, as Alistair would say, the steamy bits, and all hot under the collar? If the expectation coming into any game or story is that it must result in sex, you'd think that says a lot more about the people playing them, and, some troubling implications about what they believe they're owed in real life too. I've made my thoughts well and truly clear about the state of modern BioWare. Hopefully the EA acquisition will finally take the studio out back for the old Yellow treatment, but for as much as their early successes shaped the romance features we know in games today, they were also digging themselves deeper in the process. Take Anthem for example. You'd be hard-pressed to think of a worse example of a developer not understanding their core audience and pivoting to the live service hellscape for a game no one asked for, but from pretty much the get-go when the game was revealed and being talked about in interviews, people were specifically asking about romances. How many? Who with? We get to Dragon Age and the Veilguard again, and this is where it gets so much worse. There's a great irony in how, generally speaking, the same people who are so often banging on about safe spaces and trigger warnings and this whole song and dance of social courtesies they believe they're entitled to, are the exact same people who then create media that puts their sexual kinks and fetishes on full display. Not only is this embarrassing on many levels, but it's just gross. Veilguard is an easy example to come back to, because as if these characters weren't already the developers' super special important OCs and vanity projects for them to talk down to players, the game then also expects you to sit through their shit on screen. Tosh and Patrick Weeks going all in on the whole non-binary thing is easily the worst in an already painfully out of touch cast of characters. If we come back to the bear scene in Baldur's Gate 3 from the beginning, is any of this content, if you want to call it that, actually revealing character or relevant to the story? Because I'd say no. It's just the developer or writers living out their fantasy on screen, and obviously you must be a bigot or whatever if you don't think how stunning and brave it is. I don't want to see that shit any more than I do the average couple's bedroom, however straight or vanilla they are. But that certainly hasn't stopped a lot of developers. Whether they're nude or not doesn't really have anything to do with it. Personally, as much as I love Origins or Mass Effect, I look at that goofy dry humping today and it makes me laugh. And sure, maybe you can argue those scenes really weren't that different, but the character writing behind them certainly was. In my second and only attempt to replay Baldur's Gate 3, I tried the Dark Urge path and went all in on being evil to see what getting Minthara as a companion would be like. If you don't know, Emma Gregory is a fantastic VA that has done a lot of work in Warhammer 40k, including Celestine. I massacred the Grove because whatever, I just wanted to see what would happen. Anyway, I'm sure it's been changed by now, and I don't really care if it has, but you get to the end of Act 1 party, you have probably the most risque scene of the game, and then that's it. Minthara decides to peace out, and you only really get to recruit her at the end of Act 2. It was at this point I dropped the game, and I haven't touched it since. For better or worse, romance in video games has been linked with sex because there's an assumption that the two go hand in hand. Even games where the romance is handled a lot better, Arushale in Wrath of the Righteous for example, or Best Girl Cassia in Rogue Trader, the sex necessitates their personal growth, that the player hasn't won or reached the endpoint yet without doing so, and it's a shame both the game and story will inevitably end shortly after as a result. This all leads to the question, how can romance and sex be handled better? Firstly, it'd be nice if we let go of the idea that it has to be there in the first place. I cared a lot more about Harry in Disco Elysium, for example, and his bumbling escapades in the shadow of his ex-wife, plus that legendary failed dialogue check with Klassia, than I would flirting with a bunch of random NPCs, but also that it doesn't need to be the be-all end-all of any relationship. What I would love to see RPGs tackle is if the relationship, rather than being the endpoint, is instead the beginning. I get this is somewhat antithetical to the idea of a role-playing game, and that not many people like being pigeonholed into predefined backstories, but imagine a game centered around being in an established couple already, or the push and pull across the narrative of a whole family. I touched on this a bit with Shadowrun Hong Kong, but the depth and freedom RPGs can offer when you have that room to work with characters that are already established in the world has huge potential in storytelling. It would need to go much deeper than, say, Geralt in The Witcher as well. Those games are predicated on knowing, at least to some degree, the books and canon, so it wasn't really to CD Projekt's credit that the character writing was doing all the heavy lifting. There's also the fact that, The Witcher 3 was just as bad as GTA for how it treated sex and romance as a kind of blasé transactional affair, the cards in the first game being the worst example. Don't get me wrong, I've made it pretty clear by now that there are plenty of games I love that do the classic RPG romance thing, that I enjoy the romance and build up with characters like Morrigan, Vaconia, Arushale, etc., but RPGs and the character writing underpinning it all aren't going to evolve if we don't start trying to experiment by telling deeper, more interesting stories. Too often, the player's positioned as this random who just swoops in and gets a girl or guy. I love Judy as a character in Cyberpunk 2077, but you have to admit that V was kind of a creep to try and get with her after what happened with Evelyn. I think it's also perfectly fine if games omit romance entirely, and that players shouldn't feel entitled to romancing characters that are against the very concept of it. I myself had many people desperately ask this for characters I wrote over the years, and a character like our magenta from Rogue Trader makes perfect sense why she wouldn't be interested. Long story short, with how horny and sexual a lot of modern writing has become, we need to shift away from the sex element, that there's a prize for getting into someone's pants, and treat the relationship as its own evolving thing. With that, writing will be better, characters will have more agency and relevance than plus rewards, and RPGs can tell deeper, richer stories.